Welcome to the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute's Aquatic Invasive Species Spread Prevention Training. In this section, we're going to discuss Invasive Species 101 with AIS Management Coordinator Meg Modley with the Lake Champlain Basin Program. In this discussion, we're going to learn about the basics of aquatic invasive species in our region and beyond, some management efforts that we're taking to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species, and some other important information that we can share with boaters and community members as we have conversations about AIS.
Welcome to the Invasive Species 101 training for the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute Boat Launch Stewardship Program. My name is Meg Modley, and I am the Aquatic Invasive Species Management Coordinator for the Lake Champlain Basin Program. The Lake Champlain Basin Program was formed in 1990, and we're a federally funded organization that works with the states of New York, Vermont, and the province of Quebec on the water quality of Lake Champlain and the health of its surrounding watershed. We've worked hand in hand with the Adirondack Watershed Institute for decades on the stewardship program. Aquatic invasive species are plants, animals, and pathogens that are non-native to the region, and they have to cause some type of harm. That harm can be harm to the economy, the environment, or to human health. Often these aquatic invasive species produce self-sustaining populations that can impact our lakes and our ponds. On the left, you see a photograph of Eurasian water milfoil, an invasive aquatic plant that can often grow in up to 20 feet of water and top out at the water surface, making it difficult to swim, boat, or fish, also crowding out native species and dominating availability of light and oxygen in the water. In the middle photograph is an accumulation of spiny water flea, which are crustaceans, and you're looking at hundreds, if not thousands of them accumulated on this downrigger. This is a really aggressive crustacean that eats a lot of zooplankton and phytoplankton in the food web and has displaced and changed the base of the food web in Lake Champlain. On the right-hand side, we see the invasive zebra mussel, which is a mollusk that has entered Lake Champlain, and it is known to cut the feet of swimmers, encrust historic shipwrecks, clog water intake pipes, and they tend to grow on top of our native mussel species, eventually suffocating them. We'll take some time to review the difference between native and non-native, invasive and nuisance species. Native species are species that are indigenous to a region at the time of European settlement. There are often a number of environmental factors that limit where they grow in different types of habitats and different types of conditions. When they do grow in excess, they tend to be referred to as a nuisance species because they're growing in excess that we as humans tend not to like. Non-native species, which can also be referred to as exotic or introduced or alien, are often purposefully introduced, planted in ornamental gardens or water gardens, or they're accidentally introduced outside of their historic range, but they don't tend to grow in excess or grow out of control. And if they do, if they start to cause some kind of impact, that's when they transition from being a non-native species to an invasive species. So an invasive species is non-native. It tends to reproduce rapidly, displacing native species and causing one of those three types of harm. And then finally, nuisance species. Nuisance is really a word that we use when any of the native, non-native, or invasive species are causing some kind of impact that interferes with our human use and enjoyment of our resources. So we'll take some time to review why non-native species become invasive. Plants and animals, when they're introduced into a new environment, often lack the predators from their native place of origin. They lack parasites and diseases, which often can limit their growth where they're in their place of origin. Plants, for example, often reproduce early by multiple means, either by seeds or vegetative growth. And fish and other animals can reproduce early and frequently and have multiple modes of reproduction as well. For example, the spiny water flea in the previous slide has the female can grow clones of itself on its back and release them into the water column. They can also lay resting eggs in the sediment, which overwinter and hatch the next year when the water temperature rises to the right degree. Plants often have few special germination requirements, and animals, again, are able to monopolize on a number of different types of habitat and conditions. Plants often use up light and nutrients first, and animals often are able to eat a variety of different kinds of food in the food web. Plants and animals are also can become invasive because they are able to carry toxins or diseases that suppress or kill other species where they're introduced. In this photograph, we're looking at water from Lake Champlain. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at some of the species that come up first or wash ashore in the early spring. So in early April, we're looking at some strands of Eurasian water milfoil and curly leaf pondweed washing into shore. Whereas later in the season is when we start to see a variety of native species like Vallisneria or coontail or Elodea or duckweed. Either you may start to encounter these on boats, trailers, and watercraft coming and going from the launches later in the season, or you may see them washing up shore later in the season. But it's another opportunity to highlight how invasive species really are able to take advantage of conditions earlier in the season. Let's take a few minutes to think about where we are situated in the region. If we think about the geography of the Lake Champlain watershed, which is highlighted in this rust color, or the blue line of the Adirondack Park, we want to think about where the sources are of invasive species around us. Species do not respect political boundaries or the blue line in the Adirondack Park. They're more likely to follow watershed boundaries and temperature ranges. So thinking about where the Adirondack region is relative to the rest of the Northeast and Canada, we can think about where invasive species might come from and how they might get into the areas in the lakes that we're concerned about. When it rains in the Lake Champlain watershed, all the water that falls on that rusty color flows into Lake Champlain, and Lake Champlain drains to the north out the Richelieu River and then up into the St. Lawrence Seaway. The blue line, another political boundary here, is likely one that invasive species will not follow. But if they get into the watershed or into a lake within the watershed, they have the opportunity to move throughout the entire watershed. There are a number of different pathways by which invasive species can move across the landscape, and most of them are aided by human use or movement. So when we think about the major source of invasive species in our region, most of the harmful invasives have come into the Great Lakes in ballast water. And ballast water comes from these international ships that take on water in their port of origin to help stabilize the cargo ships. And when they come into the Great Lakes, they often dump some of that water, and in that water can be fish, mud, crustaceans, plant pieces, and they get dumped into the Great Lakes, and then species have become established in that way. That's really been a big source of aquatic invasive species for our region. Luckily, there have been a number of different international maritime organization regulations that have passed that now require interoceanic ballast water transfer. So meaning that they have to flush that ballast water in mid-ocean so that you're flushing salt water into that fresh water to help kill and remove any native species that were taken on in the port of origin before they could be released into the destination of the Great Lakes and become invasive. Then we seek out really attractive plants and other fish and things to put in our nurseries and in aquarium. There's a phenomenon I like to call the free Nemo phenomenon, where plants or organisms or fish that get too big for aquarium, the owners often like to release them instead of euthanizing them or returning them because they can no longer care for them. And that is a way in which we believe we've had a number of infestation of harmful aquatic plants and fish get into our waterways. The Adirondack Park is also laced with a number of different roadways, and we need to think about how watercraft that could have got some hitchhikers, aquatic invasive species hitchhikers on them, could then be moved inland to lakes and ponds, or you think about other terrestrial invasives or forest pests and pathogens that could be transferred inland. This is a very popular tourist area. There's a lot of camping. There's movement of firewood. And then canals is another major way that invasive species can move throughout this system, because the Great Lakes are connected to Lake Champlain and the Hudson and through the Erie Canal back to the Great Lakes through canalways. We have rules and regulations that limit the use of bait and certify that it's disease-free. But we need to think about other equipment that comes into contact with the water, like our equipment, our gear, our clothing, even our dog's fur. We can think a little bit wider about road maintenance and other kind of construction where we use fill and mulch material that could carry invasive species seeds. And then disturbance is a big one. When with climate change occurring, when there are tropical storms like Irene and Lee that come through our system, they really scour the shorelines and the lake shore, and it creates an environment where invasive species can really come in and take advantage first and regrow ahead of native species regrowth. We also have organisms in trade, so there are rules and regulations, but it's very hard to intercept the invasive tree frog that you might order online for your home aquarium. There are a few natural ways by which invasive species can move across the landscape. Seeds can move in wind and through currents and waterways. Fish can swim, and wildlife can also eat some plants and seeds that can survive moving through their intestinal tracts and being excreted out into the environment wherever those waterfowl might move, or other animals. So here, this diagram shows that Lake Champlain is home to 51 known non-native and invasive species. Please remember that that's a combination of invasive and non-natives. So we think about a dozen of these 51 are really been measured to cause some type of harm. But we are surrounded, the Adirondack region is surrounded by other waterways that have a significant number of non-native and invasive species. So there's 87 known to occur in the St. Lawrence River, 188 in the Great Lakes, and 122 in the Hudson River. And these are all connected around the Adirondack Park by canalways. There's the Champlain Canal in the Richelieu River that allows boats to pass upstream around rapids and dams into Lake Champlain. There's the Champlain Canal, which allows watercraft and fish and plants and other things to move from the Hudson River up into Lake Champlain. And then we have the Erie Canal, which connects the Great Lakes over to the Hudson and the Champlain. So here is another diagram that shows that if the source of a lot of the invasives come in through the ballast water discharge, we can think about how organisms might move around the Adirondack Park through a number of the different pathways that we reviewed. Canalways is the one where they can move on their own, they can be entrained, they can swim, or they can float through these systems into Lake Champlain, or from Lake Champlain into the Hudson. But then once they're in these sources, how might they get into Adirondack lakes? It really takes overland transport on boats and trailers or bait bucket movements for these organisms to hop from water bodies inland to uninvaded water bodies. And that's where the boat launch stewardship program really comes into play. I'm going to give an example of one of the invasive species that's causing a lot of raised awareness about the issue of canals in our region. The round goby is a small invasive fish that was introduced into the Great Lakes in the 1990s. And it reproduced and grew and started more recently in the last 5 years or so to move across the Erie Canal towards the Hudson. And the U.S. Geological Survey was tracking their movement and detected the round goby at the confluence of the Mohawk and the Hudson rivers in the summer of 2021. And so this species moved across from the Great Lakes into the Hudson, and then the next concern would be that it would swim up through the Champlain Canal into Lake Champlain. And round goby, though they look small and maybe even cute, their defining feature is that their pelvic fin, or the fin on their belly, is in a suction cup form. And our native sculpin that looks similar have a splayed fin on their belly, or their pelvic fin. But they're aggressive bait eaters. They displace native species at the base of the food web, so they outcompete our tessellated darters and our native sculpins. And unfortunately, they're known to carry disease. They can carry viral hemorrhagic septicemia, which is a disease that can impact 25 different species of freshwater fish. They also really are voracious egg eaters, and they will eat the eggs of bass, of sturgeon, of walleye, and lake trout. And so there's a lot of impacts that have been measured in other water bodies that we really just don't want to find out what the impacts would be if they got into Lake Champlain. We can only guess. But it's really elevated the work that we're doing to address the inner watershed transfer, inner basin transfer of aquatic invasive species through canalways. So we're focused on a project in the Champlain Canal where we're evaluating different methods to prevent invasive species from moving back and forth while still allowing for the watercraft that recreate through the system to pass. So what happens when we have the introduction or the threat of a new invasive species coming into the Lake Champlain watershed, we have a rapid response task force set up. This is a partnership between Vermont's, New York, and Quebec agencies and federal agencies. So New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Lake Champlain Basin Program, the New York State Canal Corporation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, Quebec Ministry of Environment, Adirondack Park Agency, Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, Parks Canada. The reason why I take the time to lay that all out is that I'm trying to express that this is a really well-coordinated interagency response. So we're really recognizing that this is a watershed impact, not something that just is a political issue of state or international boundaries. And we're working together to address the pathways by which round goby might move into Lake Champlain. And there's a known population in the St. Lawrence River that is starting to creep up the Richelieu River. So we're working with our Quebec partners on early detection monitoring and helping to prevent that population from moving into Lake Champlain. And we're also working with our New York partners in the south and the Hudson River and the Mohawk confluence here. They've spread downstream towards Poughkeepsie, and we really want to prevent them from moving upstream into Lake Champlain. So there's been a threshold action response plan developed for round goby, which means that if round goby moves further north through the different locks towards Lake Champlain, there are a number of different actions that are highlighted that can be taken. The Canal Corporation is currently conducting double flushing of locks C1 and C2, right at sort of the front of where round goby are moving up the Hudson River. And that's really to deter them from moving into the locks and getting further upstream. So flushing the canal lock once and then again before allowing watercraft to move through the system, and doing scheduled locking so that there's fewer lockages that occur. We're doing extensive early detection monitoring with USGS and US Fish and Wildlife Service, and we've hired additional staff to do education and outreach and awareness raising along the Champlain Canal corridor with businesses and different municipalities to talk about the issues and to start really strategizing some solutions. So once these organisms become established in Lake Champlain, for example, Lake Champlain becomes the source of overland transport to the lakes inland in Vermont and inland in New York, and we're very interconnected to many different lakes across the nation, actually, and into Canada. But overland on boats and trailers is the mechanism by which we're concerned these organisms might get into the Adirondack lakes or the Vermont lakes, and we have a lot to protect. The Adirondack lakes have a lot of early detection monitors that are supported by the Nature Conservancy and the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program. And they have reported that 75% of the water bodies in the Adirondack Park are invasive free. We have a lot to protect there. Similarly, in Vermont, 80% of the lakes that have been monitored have been determined to be invasive free. So your job, being out there conducting risk assessments on all watercraft that's coming and going from the lakes where you're stationed, is really our frontline defense for preventing a new introduction or the spread of an existing species in the body of water where you're working to another body of water. So we use consistent messaging, we do consistent training, we use messages such as clean, drain, dry, and stop aquatic hitchhikers. And if you're a pet or aquarium owner, don't let it loose, so that visitors in our region hear the same messages, and that hopefully is replicated to our east, to our west, to our north, and our south, so that no matter where our visitors come from, they're hearing similar messages. So what does the science tell us about overland movement of invasive species on boats and trailers and other equipment? It is documented that overland transport on boats and trailers is a mechanism of spread of aquatic invasive species, early detection of new aquatic plant infestations, and even a number of zebra mussel populations have been detected right at boat launches where motorized and non-motorized watercraft are coming and going. And we just have to remember that this is often unintentional. People who have boats and trailers and other equipment, they don't mean to bring invasive species to the body of water that they love. It is inadvertently, these hitchhikers get carried in bilge water and live wells and bait buckets. They become entrained and sometimes impinged between the boat and the trailer itself. And so we have quite a job of conducting risk assessments and looking very systematically and thoroughly on every watercraft coming and going for where these organisms might be and where they might hide. And the good news is that when you are consistent and when you are attentive, your efforts are effective. So you can be 88% effective at removing aquatic invasive plants or macrophytes from boats, trailers, and other equipment. But if you start to think about early life stages of aquatic plants and animals, we know that if we have a high-risk watercraft, which means it's coming from a body of water where there's known small-bodied organisms like zebra mussels or spiny water flea or Asian clam or some other invasive fish that might have a resting egg stage that we can't see with the naked eye, that using the best available technology, which are our decontamination stations, high-pressure hot water units, are also 91% effective at removing or killing or flushing invasive species. So this is where we call the no-see-ums when we conduct our risk assessment and we determine that there is a risk either of a watercraft, let's say, leaving Lake Champlain, where we know we have zebra mussels, and it's going to an uninvaded water body, the water that could even be in the motor of the watercraft could carry the early life stages of those zebra mussels. So we want to recommend that they flush their motor with hot hot water. So internal compartments, we use 120-degree water, and externally, and low pressure for internal compartments. And externally, we use high pressure 140-degree water. And this really helps spray off, remove, and flush out invasive species that we can't see with the naked eye. So we summarize and you collect every single interaction you have on the boat launch. You're collecting really critical data, and this data helps inform where we station our boat launch stewards and our decontamination stations across the landscape. We have summarized our boat launch steward data, and we have a state of the lake report that we put out every 3 years. So the last summary of data for Lake Champlain, which includes the Adirondack Watershed Institute data from the stewards that are supported on the New York side of the lake. And we add to that the Vermont stewardship data from the Vermont side of the lake. We also have stewards who work in Quebec on Missisquoi Bay. And we cover a few of the remote locations on the northern New York side of Lake Champlain too. And so when we summarize that information, what we see is when folks are launching into Lake Champlain, we ask the last body of water that they were in. And we record that. And we have summarized that. And what we see is that we have a lot of traffic that comes from the Hudson River. And just as a reminder, the last time we checked, there were 122 known non-native invasive species in the Hudson River. Lake George and other inland New York bodies of water like Saratoga Lake and Schroon Lake have species. Surprisingly, Lake George has Asian clam, and Lake Champlain has not been detected to have Asian clam yet, even though Lake George flows into Lake Champlain. The conditions between the outlet of Lake George and Lake Champlain are not super compatible with Asian clam growth. So, we want to slow and deter that spread for as long as possible. We also see that Lake Champlain is really interconnected to the St. Lawrence River and the Richelieu River. And those are, again, places where we know there are organisms that are not present in Lake Champlain yet. Connecticut River, we have a lot of traffic coming from the Connecticut River, and there is a known infestation of hydrilla, which is an invasive aquatic plant that's been deemed by the Army Corps of Engineers to be one of the worst aquatic invasive plants, worse than Eurasian water milfoil. And when we have traffic coming from that body of water, we really want to make sure that we're inspecting those watercraft and that equipment to make sure that we don't get hydrilla in Lake Champlain and then be the source for other inland water bodies in the region. And then we have a lot of other traffic coming from other inland water bodies in Lake Champlain, in Vermont, but these don't have additional invasive species that we don't already have in Lake Champlain at this time. And then the Atlantic Ocean, and it is obviously a saltwater source. It's very unlikely that any of the organisms in the Atlantic Ocean would survive in Lake Champlain, but there are a few that can sustain some huge salinity changes that might do okay in Lake Champlain for a few days, but then not. And in the past, we've had a number of saves. So we want to think about saves in terms of how stewards inspect and remove and prevent movement to and from bodies of water. So we intercepted hydrilla coming from the Connecticut River into Lake Champlain. That was a huge save. And then since we are now a source of both spiny water flea and fishhook water flea, when the water temperature gets just right, these organisms just explode in growth in the water column and accumulate on fishing lines and downriggers. And so these are globs of probably hundreds of thousands of these crustaceans. And we want to make sure these do not move inland to other bodies of water. So they're busy removing and treating equipment, soaking it in containers with hot water to make sure that these organisms are not spread inland lakes. And so what happens when an aquatic invasive species, gets in by one of these different pathways? Water chestnut entered Lake Champlain through the Champlain Canal back in the 1940s, and we have been managing this population ever since. And so, you are preventing these occurrences from happening. Um, and so we'll, again, just reinforcing that clean, drain, dry message. And then once these organisms become established, we have quite a job to do to manage them. This is a graphic depicting the management of water chestnut in Lake Champlain over time. The water chestnut population came in from the south through the Champlain Canal and really, really invaded all the way up for the, almost the lower half of Lake Champlain. And in 1990, this red color depicts where there were dense beds meeting over 25% density growth. And this is the mechanical harvesting area. So water chestnut is an annual plant, and it's one of the few aquatic invasive plants that we're really successful at managing, because if we can remove those rosettes that you saw growing on the water surface before they drop their nutlets, we can really start to impact the population. And the yellow depicts where we're doing hand harvesting and surveying. So over time, we've been able to slowly reduce the population in Lake Champlain such that we're focusing our mechanical harvesting efforts in the southern end of the lake. And all of the surveying and hand harvesting is occurring in these sites. And then we have a few satellite locations that we're managing as well. And this is a huge interstate, international, multi-agency effort that costs over $500,000 annually to maintain. So we want to talk about some of the ecological impacts of invasive species versus the benefits of native species. So ecological impacts of invasives, again, they can decrease native plant and animal diversity. They're really able to utilize light, oxygen, and crowd out native plants. They can alter the food web dynamics and carry disease. They decrease habitat complexity. In many cases, we have riparian species that can increase their erosion rate or sediment and nutrient loading. In some shallow ponds and bays, excessive aquatic plant growth can accelerate eutrophication of the lake and lake aging. And then there can be impacts to pH and temperature levels in shallow bodies of water where there's excessive plant growth. It can really heat up. And then the benefits of native plants and why we want to support their growth. They provide food and habitat and shelter for many species within the food web. They produce oxygen and protect the shoreline from erosion, reduce turbidity, and support diversity. And here, just showing two photographs. This is variable leaf milfoil. They look like bottle brushes growing in a very dense bed in one of our inland lakes here. And this is an invasive fish called alewife. And this is a landlocked population in Lake Champlain. And this fish species has been outcompeting our native smelt population, but they're also really sensitive to temperature and oxygen changes in the lake. And when that occurs, there are huge die-offs, which can be unsightly and rather stinky and become a human health concern when they pile up on the shorelines on Lake Champlain. So the ecological impacts are diverse. We do know that invasive species are the second leading cause of the loss of biodiversity worldwide, next to habitat destruction. So they play a really significant role in altering what our ecosystems look like, disrupting food webs and food chains, and decreasing, biodiversity. Economic impacts are really significant. The last analysis showed that we were spending over 120 billion in damages every year. We want to think about locally again, investing in water chestnut management every year, $500,000. We have reduced water quality from invasive species. If you think about forest pests and pathogens and other impacts, really costly productivity to forests, fisheries, agricultural, and rangelands. A lot of what we're going to encounter is the impaired use of boating, fishing, um, and swimming in our lakes, and that have significant populations of invasive species. And then we do have documentation that where there's really dense beds of plant growth along the shoreline, property values have decreased over time. And this can really impact tourism, which is a driver in our economy in the Adirondack region and in Vermont. The Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program supported an economic impact analysis of looking at 8 invasive species, 4 were aquatic and 4 were terrestrial in the Adirondack Park. And what they found in this study was that there's over $4 million being spent on invasive species in the Adirondacks every year. I dare say that this number has at least come close to doubling since this report was conducted. There's a lot of resources being spent on invasive species management and spread prevention right now in the Adirondack region. And at the time of the study, there was an estimated annual loss of income of 48 to 53 million dollars, and property value loss. They estimated a loss between 420 and 840 million. So this is the invasive species curve. This is a graphic that almost everyone involved in invasive species management has become familiar with. And basically what it's showing is the relationship between time, acres of infestation, and control costs. So the message here is that if we have trained people out looking for invasive species in our lakes and ponds, and they detect something early in the invasion curve, then eradication or management of that species until we can remove it from the system has a chance. Often detection doesn't occur until the infestation grows to the point that we can recognize it without necessarily looking for it, like it's an eyesore. And at that point, local control and management may be possible to contain it from moving to other bodies of water, but the infestation is likely not going to be able to be managed. So as time goes on and a new plant or animal becomes established in a water body, the harder it is to manage it and control it. The costs go up, the area of infestation goes up, and the likelihood of removing it from the ecosystem decreases over time. And again, public awareness, if you're not trained to look for invasive species, if you're not a trained invasive patroller, you don't really recognize these organisms until later in the invasion curve. So once these species become established, there are a number of different tools we have in our toolbox to manage all different types of taxa, so plant, fish, invertebrates, mammals, pathogens. And the most commonly utilized methods are physical methods. So if we have a new infestation of Eurasian water milfoil, we have diver-assisted hand removal, so hand pulling. There's mechanical harvesters that can cut plants that might not necessarily reduce the population because plants can regrow from seed and vegetatively, so it may just be sort of mowing the lawn to maintain navigability or access. There could be like digging or dredging, mowing, or matting. And so here you see a benthic barrier mat, which is much like a pond liner, a plastic mat that you can spread out over an infestation. And we're trying to manage early on the Asian clam infestation in Lake George here. We have chemical controls, so using pesticides or herbicides to manage plants or fish. So here you can see application of herbicides or pesticides management in bodies of water. There are biological controls. So the APHIS and Army Corps of Engineers and lots of other researchers working at Cornell, for example, are looking at what organisms could be bred and introduced, making sure they don't carry disease or other harmful impacts. So biological controls that could help to regulate dense infestations of invasive species. So weevils and beetles that might prefer to eat these invasive plants if they do not cause harm to other native species can be reared and introduced to help manage large populations of invasive species. And then there's some cultural practices. So oftentimes we'll see the introduction of goat grazing for some some terrestrial plants, or prescribed burning. And we have a lot of rules and regulations, so quarantines and educational programs about prevention. Um, there is reclamation, revegetation, so replanting areas that are treated, or reclamation is really treating an entire system and then hopefully resupplying it with native species, or we can do nothing. So early detection and rapid response are key pieces here for managing aquatic invasive plants and animals. And so if we can detect them early and we have a rapid response team in place to respond, it is likely that we'll have some success in managing these species. But if we wait and we do nothing, or if we let an infestation of, Eurasian water milfoil or purple loosestrife get out of control, we find ourselves in a difficult situation where it is no longer feasible, technically feasible, socially feasible, or financially feasible to manage these infections. So prevention, the Watercraft Inspection Stewardship Program, is the prevention program to address this overland transport of boats and trailers and other equipment. And it's complemented by state rules and regulations. We have states have trained volunteers to monitor for aquatic invasive species and report them to a reporting tool like IMAP Invasives, where we can track where species are, and we can go out and respond if there is something new that we need to address. We even have some funds and resources set aside to be able to get out there and do that management. And New York is really a leader in the arena of invasive species management, coordination, control, research, implementation, and spread prevention. The state has an approved aquatic invasive species management plan, and that plan is supported with resources from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA. And there's a huge investment from the state into staff and coordinating these different PRISMs, or partnerships for regional invasive species management. And this Adirondack Park invasive plant program PRISM is supporting, this watershed stewardship region, and it's a very strong region in New York. And I think a lot of other states are looking to New York for the leadership that they're showing in their watershed steward program. So we're working with other states in New Hampshire and Maine and Massachusetts and Quebec, and even in Connecticut, on collecting similar data, and whether we call these watercraft inspectors stewards or greeters or hosts, we're all working towards sharing the similar message of clean, drain, dry, doing those risk assessments, checking the watercraft, preventing the spread of invasive species. So in conclusion, invasive species have really significant environmental and economic costs. Human activities often introduce and spread invasive species. Prevention and early response are critical if we're going to get an edge on managing and preventing further spread. And volunteer efforts are essential to inventory and help inform management and control activities. But people are part of the problem and the solution. So we really want to drive that home, that folks are often unknowingly or unintentionally moving aquatic hitchhikers across the landscape. And since that movement is there, that's part of the problem. But you can help them be part of the solution by engaging with them and giving them the best management practices that they can take to clean, drain, and dry their watercraft. And we really like to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So you guys, again, can help prevent the spread of invasive species by imparting the spread prevention measure on everyone that you interact with, and help preventing the overland movement of these invasives on watercraft and equipment. And I just wanted to take a minute to ask you about why you care about the waters that you're here to protect. Why did you take this job? What will motivate you to conduct thorough inspections when it's cold and raining or hot and buggy and there are tons of boats lined up? For me, it's my love of the water and my favorite lakes that I spend time in, on, or under. I want the lakes that I am in and around to have clean water that's safe to swim and drink and eat the fish out of. So I want to thank you for stepping up to this challenge of protecting Adirondack lakes and being an Adirondack watershed steward this summer. Thank you.